Anyway, what we're going to do this afternoon is take a brief look at the way that ancient Egypt has interfaced with both Bristol and Bath. I know I'm being possibly slightly disloyal by going a little bit further up the Avon, but there's actually quite a lot of things whereby the Egyptology of Bristol and Bath come together very, very closely. So really one has to, one really can deal with the two of them very much looking in the same topic. Anyway, so kicking off. Now, the story of ancient Egypt's involvement with Bristol and Bath really comes down to this gentleman, Giovanni Battista Belzoni, who, as from his name, you can tell he's not a West Country lad, came from Italy, but came to the UK in the early 19th century to seek his fortune, and then went on to Egypt to do the same thing. And as such, he was a pioneer excavator, although certainly very rough and ready by modern standards. He probably doesn't really really deserve the term tomb robber, which has often been thrown at him, compared with his contemporaries, some of whom are regarded as being proper academics, quote unquote. He was very careful with what he worked on. He didn't actually hack things out of walls of tombs, and as we'll see, he was one of the pioneers of copying entire Egyptian monuments. After a number of years in Egypt, he came back to the UK and displayed his results of his excavations. In particular, in the Valley of the Kings, here he had discovered the tomb of King Seti I, which is one of the most spectacular discoveries of its time. And this is Belzoni's own rendering of the tomb, showing the way the decoration lies all the way from the entrance all the way through to the interior. It's the first royal tomb to actually do such a thing. But Belzoni is the first person to ever get a copy made of an entire tomb like this. It wasn't purely for academic purposes, however. One of his objectives when he came back to the UK was to display, as part of his exhibition of the material he'd found in Egypt, a scale model of the tomb. And that it's for that reason that scale copies were made of every wall of the tomb. And these were done by Alessandro Ricci, an Italian doctor who was also a skilled artist and was employed by a number of other excavators to produce copies. This whole ensemble was displayed in the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly in London, which wasn't intended for Egyptian displays. It was simply, in the early 19th century, there was, as we'll see shortly, something of a vogue for Egyptianizing architecture, and this happened to be done with an Egyptianizing facade about 15 years before Belzoni's time. But of course, if you're doing a blockbuster display, and in many ways, Belzoni's display was the first great blockbuster Egyptian display ever to be put on. If you've got a building which has got an Egyptian facade, hey, that's great. And this is part of that model. Only about half of it now survives after Belzoni's death. The various bits and pieces of it disappeared, sold off, got lost and whatever. But here you can just see one wall, which is actually the opposite wall to this one here, showing the beautiful work carried out. And Ricci was an extremely skilled artist. And when he was copying all this stuff, nobody could actually read the hieroglyphs, the Egyptian script here. Which often meant it was problematic for people to copy. But Ricci's artistic eye was such that the hieroglyphic signs were copied extremely accurately. And as quite a bit of the tomb is now badly damaged, this material is absolutely invaluable. And this material is all in Bristol, but the story of exactly how it got to Bristol is something I will pick up on a little bit later on. Now, after the exhibition, a lot of the material was then sold off in London by Belzoni, and a number of items were then appeared in Bath as part of an exhibition, and this is the flyer for it, and includes 2 Egyptian mummies with their coffins, which we can see on the right of the screen there, and a number of other items. Now, it's not 100% certain that all of these came from the London display, and also what Belzoni's involvement in this display was, if any, whether it was simply that things had been bought off of Belzoni and some local entrepreneurs were putting this exhibition on, or whether or not Belzoni had a part in it. Now, Belzoni's wife, Sarah, the latest research suggests she may well have been a Bristolian. So it's possible that this is the reason why this material was put on, came to Bath. And as we'll see, it stayed in Bath for quite some time. And this is actually where the exhibition actually was. Just an ordinary shop which had been hired for the display. But the excitement about ancient Egypt around this time was such that it wasn't just this exhibition which was held in Bath. It looks as though probably a spoiler exhibition was being held at the same time. And here is a cutting from a local newspaper talking about there being another mummy on display in Milsom Street, only a little way away from where the big exhibition was, or larger exhibition was. And that is 18 Milsom Street as it is today. So that for a short period, in 1822, there were no fewer than 3 Egyptian mummies and associated Egyptian items on display in Bath. And just so you can see where they are, in fact, you could just carry on down the same road, and you could end up taking in both of the exhibitions in October 1822. This material ended up in the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, along with some other Egyptian items whose origins are unclear. It does seem, though, that Brilsey did acquire the New Bond Street exhibition, and also was then also acquiring other stuff. But unfortunately, the records are virtually non-existent of how the Bath Egyptian collection was acquired. In fact, one of 2, because there's also Egyptian material in the Roman Baths Museum as well, but that is a completely separate thing. That was acquired via the route which ends up with the Roman Baths Museum. This is the Brilsey material, which remained at Brilsey, or at least in storage in Bath, until 1966, when, as we'll see, it moved downriver. Talking of downriver, this is where the Bristol ancient Egypt story begins. The Bristol Institution for the Advancement of Science and Art, which is now Freemasons Hall at the bottom of Park Street. The Bristol Institution was, like Brilsey in Bath and similar bodies throughout the UK, a place intended for the promotion of various things to do with science and art, particularly natural history, but also archaeology, both local and more exotic. And the first material appeared in 1822-23. There's a stela, which was the first item which arrived, but shortly afterwards, this coffin in 1824, presented by the city chamberlain, who was then the head finance officer of the Bristol Corporation. So this coffin is the first major Egyptian item to come to the museum. More material arrived over the following decade, between 1824 and 1834. And in fact, this little tableau is from a mummy unwrapping which took place in 1834. Here is the victim of the mummy unwrapping here, a lady called Ta'iri, whose coffins are, this is the inner one, this is her outer one there. There's that coffin from 1824, which I showed in the previous slide. There's the mummy from another coffin, which had been acquired in the intervening years, and another mummy here, again, all acquired between 1824 and 34. And just at the front here is that very, very first stela, which is now on display in M Shed. This is really quite neat because it gives a nice sort of conspectus of the principal items which were in the institution's collection in 1834. The mummy possibly is represented by a headless skeleton, which Sue Giles and I found in the basement a few years ago. But what definitely comes from it are these three rather unprepossessing wax things, which are actually the figures of the four sons of Horus, who are protective deities, figures of whom are often placed inside the body cavities of mummies at the time this one was mummified, which is around about 800 BC. Another Egyptianizing element of Bristol came in around the same sort of time, when this is the original design by Brunel for the suspension bridge. And as you can see, it is very, very definitely owes a lot to ancient Egypt. Winged sun disk, it had with sphinxes, the cavetto cornice, pylon, whole thing designed to look like an Egyptian temple gateway. So with the addition of sphinxes, which became quite popular around this kind of time to put on top of buildings. There's a couple on top of the National Gallery in Edinburgh, for example, rather incongruously. However, as many of you will be aware, there was a point where the suspension bridge ran out of money. It was suspended. No pun intended, and therefore the actual towers, when complete, were left in very much the raw state, although one can still see from them that original Egyptianizing inspiration from the original. But we can still actually see here at the Clifton end, at the Leigh Woods end, we can see that these two toll houses were actually completed to the original Egyptianizing design. Unfortunately, the ones at the other end, at the Clifton end, were demolished and then replaced by modern ones, and then replaced again by yet more modern ones. So, but this end of the bridge, you get something of a feel for what the original idea was. And we have a few other little bits of Egyptian doorways. For example, Clifton Lido, for example, has these doorways on it. Possibly inspired by the bridge down the way. I've never done any real digging to try and work out sort of what inspired those. But again, throughout the early part of the 19th century, there was quite a bit of a push to use Egyptianizing architecture rather as an alternative to classical or to Gothic. The collection at the British Institution grew and grew and grew until by the end of the 1860s it had very much outgrown the original building, and therefore a new museum was built at the top of Park Street, where the collections all moved in 1871, and the original building was sold off to the Freemasons. This is the original Bristol Museum, now Brown's Restaurant, most of it anyway. There's still a little bit which is actually part of the museum, but this part was bombed in 1941 and never returned to the museum. And in fact, the current museum is this area here, which is still made up of other buildings, including parts of University College, which became Bristol University in 1909. Some more Egyptian material in Bristol at this time was in the houses owned by Thomas Pease, who had travelled extensively in Egypt in the 1840s, originally at Henbury Hill, his original house, and then later at Coat Bank, about a mile or so away, just off where Falkendale Road is today. Unfortunately, both his houses were demolished and there's modern housing on the location. An acquaintance of Pease was this lady, probably the most important woman in the history of Egyptology, Amelia Blandford Edwards, who lived most of her life in Westbury-on-Trim at the Larches in Eastfield. Unfortunately, her house was hit by a bomb in 1941. It's the only house which was hit during the Bristol Blitz in that area. And of course, Sod's Law is it was the one belonging to a historical figure. She was originally a novelist and also a writer of travelogues. And in the latter role, she went to Egypt in the mid-1870s, was completely taken over by Egypt, and spent the rest of her life promoting the excavation, preservation of Egyptian antiquities. And her Egyptian connections are shown by her grave here in Henbury Churchyard, although it's only the Ankh, the Egyptian sign of life, which actually it reflects her Egyptian background. The obelisk behind it was not actually originally intended for Amelia at all. It was intended for the daughter of her companion, because there's three of them buried in the grave: Amelia, her companion, and her companion's daughter. And that daughter died long before Amelia even went to Egypt. So it's just simply a Victorian obelisk, which goes around Victorian cemeteries. Lots of obelisks, clearly Egyptian inspired. However, in this particular case, there's no connection between there being an obelisk on it and the fact you've got a rather important figure in British Egyptology. Her importance was twofold, both during her lifetime and after her death, because this is the plaque marking the current location of her former house in Eastfield. But the fact that she was responsible for founding the two most important entities in British Egyptology, the Egypt Exploration Fund in 1882, which later became the Egypt Exploration Society, which since then has been the UK's premier body for organising field work in Egypt. And I was actually its chairman for some years ago. And these are a few early photographs showing some of their early excavations. But basically, been working in Egypt from 1882 right through to the present day. And then when Amelia died in 1892, she left her estate to the University College London, where the first ever chair of Egyptology in the UK was founded on the basis of it. Unlike other countries in Europe, the UK had never had any professional Egyptology in any of its universities. So basically, Amelia really sets up British Egyptology for the coming century. She actually died here in Weston-super-Mare at Royal Terrace, which is now the Royal Grosvenor Hotel. And in fact, in many ways, she was almost killed by Egyptology. She broke her health on a mammoth lecture tour of North America, and then caught a chill while supervising the unloading of objects from Egypt at the docks in London, caught a chill and died a few months later in Weston. But anyway, University College London, the chair there is very much her great memorial. Back in Bristol, University College Bristol had been founded in 1876 and was one of the first institutions in the country to actually teach ancient Egyptian. And this gentleman, Ernest Sibrey, was responsible for teaching the language from the 1890s right through to his death in 1927. Although after that, Egyptology effectively died at Bristol University until the 1990s, when I arrived. You remember me talking a little bit earlier on about the model of Tomb of Seti I, which had been produced for Belzoni's exhibition. Well, the remains of that passed from Belzoni, who died only a year or so later on trying to get to Timbuktu, passed to his widow, And ultimately, what was left of the model and a few other bits and pieces which had once belonged to Belzoni passed to his goddaughter, Selina Belzoni Tucker. And this is her gravestone in Milton Road Cemetery in Weston-super-Mare. So this clearly, this is probably part of this whole West Country connection I was mentioning, probably via Belzoni's wife. And from her, when she died in 1893, the remains went to a distant cousin, Sarah Tucker. And from Sarah, they were donated to the museum in 1900 by her son. There was often there was a long time a lot of confusion over why it came to Bristol, because her son worked at a school in London. However, it turned out he was simply acting as an agent for his mother, who lived in Weston, who clearly got a number of packing cases of replicas of an Egyptian tomb she didn't really want, and therefore Bristol Museum got them simply because it was the nearest appropriate institution. So hence in 1900, the museum got the various facsimiles done by Ricci, and also some secondary copies of those for a second exhibition model. And they are amongst the prized possessions of Bristol Museum. It also has received the only surviving notebook of Belzoni as well. This one was clearly him doing various drawings of Egyptian temples. And this is a plan of the Temple of Amun at Medinet Habu. The Egyptian material moved into a new building built in 1904, which was intended as both the art gallery and the Museum of Antiquities. And the Egyptian material has lived in this area just to the right of the entrance pretty well ever since. Bristol Museum's collections of Egyptian antiquities came from various sources. Some had come from the British Institution, but also quite a few came from the Egypt Exploration Society, previously fund, which Amelia had founded and clearly encouraged her local museum to subscribe to. And also various private collections and so on have been given over the years. But also in 1966, the Brilsey collection from Bath was placed on long-term loan at the Bristol Museum, because it hadn't been on display in Bath for decades, and at that time Brilsey was moribund, and therefore the stuff was all transferred on long-term loan, so including the couple of things I showed earlier on. A few other sort of highlights: in 1981, there was the great mummy unwrapping of a man called Hiram Kanazi, an official from around about 1000 BC, whose mummy had come to deteriorate in the very hot summer of 1976, and was therefore anatomically taken apart effectively in 1981. One of a very important sort of detailed examination of a mummy using modern techniques. And sort of bring up to the present day, the focus of Egyptology in Bristol remains the museum, with the gallery, which was opened in 2007. There is still a little bit of Egyptology at the museum, at the university, incorporated into the teaching of the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology, which is where I am based. So thank you for your attention, and hopefully I've given you a very, very brief whistle-stop tour of the relationship between ancient Egypt and this part of the world.